This is a breastfed baby. But you want to talk about the experience of what it meant.
Avery is about to be 10 months old, and we are still breastfeeding.
Yes, I see.
She took her first unassisted steps the other day.
When I had her in 1975, it was not the thing to do. So none of my friends breastfed. I didn't. I had the baby. I had to go back to work. And workplaces were really not that friendly. We would have lost our jobs, quite frankly, immediately if we had said, you know, I need to make arrangements so that I can, you know, pump.
Exactly.
Or, it just didn't enter our minds. So. It's missing once more.
Amazing.
There we go.
So, you know, originally my plan was, or my thought was always, you know, to get to that 1 year mark, because, you know, that's where all the doctors say if you can get to a year, it would be just great. And I always thought if I could get to that year, I would feel like a champion. And now that we're not that far away from the year, I actually find myself sort of thinking, you know, maybe we'll just sort of do this until it doesn't make sense anymore. So
She's going to be walking soon, you know. Well, I knew that I was going to do formula, you know, right away. You know, when I had my daughter, there was no pressure from my mother that I should breastfeed. I mean, she was a working woman, had worked all of her life. She was clearly, you have your baby, you know, spend some time with her, and then you go back to work. We've been working people, pursuing careers, so it's never, I mean, housewifery was not something, at least in my family and my friends, that was something that was, or stay-at-home mommy was not an option either financially or something. You know, I was just delighted when Elizabeth said that she was going to stay home, and I said, well, Avery, you're the luckiest baby in the whole wide world. So.
what happened? Hey. It's hard for me to think of a friend of mine who did not breastfeed their child. The one thing that that did surprise me was the level of pride I felt in it. So, you know, when we would go to the doctor and she would get weighed and, you know, the doctor would squeeze her thighs and be like, look at those great thighs. I would just sort of think to myself, oh, I did that.
And I think what was interesting is Elizabeth was talking about the baby, the hospital where the baby was born, only working towards being a baby-friendly hospital, which is shocking given its stature in the medical world. Elizabeth and the NICU were separated by several floors, so, you know, here's a mother who's just had a C-section having to walk or get in a wheelchair and go 2 floors to feed her baby. A sack? Are you interested in a sack? Needless to say, I was shocked when I saw how chubby she was getting and how much weight she was putting on with Elizabeth breastfeeding. So I am a complete devotee.
You're a devotee.
A believer in breastfeeding, right? No, my mother did not breastfeed me, and it may have been because she was ill. I remember distinctly, we also lived on a farm, so my guess is the milk came from our cows. Non-pasteurized to be sure, and I distinctly remember my bottle was a Coca-Cola bottle with a nipple on top. This is rural Alabama, 1940s. So I think, though, that certainly her mother breastfed her. There were 15 children. There just wasn't any other option. I mean, formula did not exist then.
It can be extraordinarily difficult, even under the best circumstances at work. You know, and I think that often gets in the way of, you know, the very best intentions.
I think the more we talk about the value of it, and I think the more bosses and companies understand it and create a receptive environment for it, then I think you'll find more Black women taking advantage of it. Right?
This is a breastfed baby.
Look at those.
All right, welcome. We always like to start with a video to give everyone an opportunity to come in, and we warmly invite you to sign in the chat. This is a presentation put together by Breastfeed Durham. with financial support from the Durham County Department of Public Health and the Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute. We are a health equity organization, and we are so excited to be celebrating Black Maternal Health Week today, and getting to connect with our community in so many different ways. We thought that video was a really wonderful way to warm up this presentation. I love the way that they intersected maternal health and well-being, working, breastfeeding, culture. I think those are all the things that we've been able to explore over this First Food Equity series. This is the April presentation, and we've been doing this since October. We have one left. We really wanted to dive deep and talk about first food equity, but with a center of race equity, and thinking about the intersection between breastfeeding and race and the way that those two pieces intersect. We believe that this work is part of the first food justice movement, part of the reproductive justice movement. And we at Breastfeed Durham love to take this opportunity to really focus on the breastfeeding, human milk feeding, and chest feeding aspects. We're thrilled today to have Tonya, who's always amazing in talking about the intersection between healthcare and breastfeeding. And we are so pleased that all of you could join us, but especially our healthcare providers. We really want to celebrate our collaboration and our process of beginning to work together. At the same time, it was really striking to me as they talked about the importance of a baby-friendly hospital. And that's near and dear to my heart and the hearts of so many community advocates here at Breastfeed Durham. We are looking forward to being able to live in the city of medicine and have that city have a baby-friendly hospital. And we continue to celebrate the work that Duke System Health is doing towards moving towards baby-friendly, and continue to advocate that both Duke Regional and Big Duke achieve that journey, because we know that particularly those who are most marginalized often, and those with the highest health issues often end up at Big Duke. And so we're really excited about watching Duke go through this process. And I also want to just warmly welcome all of our primary care providers and our clinicians, and all the ways that you are here working and learning and growing on this journey to celebrate families. As well as I want to welcome all of our community partners that were able to join us today. We really want, and we are counting on all of you who are able to come together to help us spread the word that receiving and continuing education on breastfeeding is critical to closing disparity gaps here in Durham. The CDC knows this, we all know this, but I also really recognize that in this meeting, I'm often preaching to the choir. We really appreciate that you're taking this opportunity to engage in continuing education and spread this information with your colleagues. We are recording these presentations, and we will be sharing them with the team as we go forward. I'm rushing because that video took a little bit longer than I anticipated, but together we build a community of care that prioritizes the health and well-being of families and communities. We're really excited to have Tonya join us today. The first time I got to hear her present was at the very beginning of my equity journey and learning about breastfeeding. I was a new Leche League leader, and my babies were a lot smaller, and she was presenting at the Triangle Breastfeeding Alliance conference. And you know that saying about how it doesn't always matter what you say, it matters how you make people feel. And all I can remember about Tonya's presentation is I love the way that she interwove her experience of being a parent and a healthcare provider and a community advocate, and it all started to come together. And it inspired me and inspired our journey. And I'm really excited to hear and learn more about her work today. So Tonya, I'm going to stop presenting and let you take it away.
So I wanted to first say, first of all, love, thank you so much. You have been just a rock star. I've been kind of watching your growth and how you've been championing things that are in the Durham area for a long time as well. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Tonya Daniel. And what Love was talking about is a lot of the reason I became in this work is because of my experiences as a parent, as a pregnant person, kind of, as people say, growing up in this day and age. And so I'm glad to be having this conversation with you all today. And I've entitled this presentation is not just about the destination, it's the journey. And we're going to talk a little bit about the birth practices and how it really impacts breastfeeding and lactation initiation and the duration. Okay. Now, full disclosure with this, I'm not just going to discuss every practice that a pregnant person may have to interact with, just some of the most common ones. And just by looking at the chat, I see that a lot of you in here are providers and community people and students, and you interact with pregnant people on a regular basis. So feel free, and I was glad to see on the slide that it actually said, ask questions. I call this couch conversations. So a lot of times I like to hear if people have comments or different things. You can say it, ask during. I just ask for somebody to monitor the chat because sometimes I don't see the chat. And then if afterwards, if there's time, if people want to ask questions, then that's also a possibility, and I'm totally open. I call myself pretty much a facilitator of the discussion. I by no means am an expert, but I do bring a lot of my life experiences into some of the things that I've learned, some of the things that I practice, and that really does govern how I work with families that I serve. Okay. All right, so our goals today, we're going to address the birth goals in light of lactation support. So we're going to talk about really how that decisions we make and the families we make about their birth, how that affects their lactation. We're going to talk about practices that are protective for human milk feeding, as well as some of those practices that are commonplace, but also present challenges. Okay, and then finally, we have a good network here. We're living in areas where, I've seen different people. I see a 336 number and, people from all over the place. We're going to talk about and brainstorm ways that we can collaborate with others in the perinatal professions and within our community to make it work for our families, to really increase those initiation and duration rates. Okay. So pretty much, I address this almost like a journey. We talked about the destination and the journey. We know that typically a pregnancy lasts for about 40 weeks, give or take a few weeks. And many times people forget that the baby and the body have to work together for that process, and hormones play a big part of it. And so there's a type of hormonal camaraderie between the birthing person and the baby for labor to start and for the birth to actually happen. So we pretty much kind of know that, right? And since we're talking about journeys, let's take a little talk about, the tools that we need for that journey. What are the things we need to pack along with us? So I'm going to go over this, and some of you in here may be very familiar with these, but I'm going to talk about them a little bit in the way of how I talk to the families that I work with, okay? Not just all professionals, but really to help them understand the terminology when they're going into these into their provider offices or in their community when they talk about their healthcare. So this is a graphic that I use in my class when I teach childbirth, and when I also train doulas, and I'm a doula. When I'm teaching these and talking about this in my class, this is a graphic that I use when I'm also talking with the families, and it shows an overview of the labor and birth process. Okay, y'all see a face. People get a real kick out of the person's face when they talk about the different processes of labor. The average labor can take anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. Sometimes it can be shorter, sometimes it can be longer, but the goal is still the same: to dilate the cervix, the opening of the uterus, from 0 to 10 centimeters to get the actual birth. And I make sure I let the families know that, just so they know what's going to happen in their body. And I also let them know that it's a process, that it actually takes time. And any of us who have ever had babies know that to go from 0 centimeters to 10 centimeters, you're glad that it takes some time. Okay, so, all right. So while I'm going to go through the birth process pretty quickly, I want you to think about what you already know about these hormones and the comparison between birth and lactation and the feeding process. Okay, everybody still with me? Okay, because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, so I'm trying not to rush too much. Okay, so first of all, the first hormone that we have is estrogen. Estrogen, pretty much, there is one of its primary roles is to make the uterus sensitive to oxytocin. Okay, and oxytocin is what's needed for the contractions of the uterus. Okay, now one thing I want to point out that that really doesn't make a whole lot of impact right now, but if you happen to be working with someone who has low estrogen, or somebody who's had fertility issues or other hormonal issues, starting labor and having that uterus be sensitive to oxytocin may be an issue for those people. So I want you to just to put that little seed in your mind when we start talking about some of the different practices. So if we have somebody who has challenges with estrogen and their estrogen levels, that may be an issue. So I just want to put that out there as an aside to be thinking about. Okay, so then we have another hormone, progesterone. Okay, that progesterone is there to maintain the pregnancy. It's what kind of keeps the body remembering that it's pregnant. Okay. Then next we have oxytocin. That's almost like the star of the show. We hear sometimes it's called the love hormone, or a hormone when we have sex and you climax, and we're adults here, so that we know all that, what all that is. So that is a hormone that really stimulates the uterus to cause the contractions, and those are needed in order for that baby to be born vaginally. Okay, so we also have prolactin. Now, most of you who are here, I'm pretty sure you probably know a little bit about prolactin. That's the milk-making hormone. It's also can be called the mothering hormone. And that builds during pregnancy, is there during pregnancy, but it also builds during labor and birth to prepare for the feeding of the baby. All right. Now, the last two hormones are ones that you may not hear a whole lot about when it's talking about lactation, but it's very, very prominent in birth. Okay, catecholamines and cortisol. Okay, those are the stress hormones, and both mom and the baby make these. Okay, and it's beneficial for blood flow, and it's also increases over time to cause the contractions to speed up. And so it moves the labor along. So in essence, is pretty much is not a bad thing, but too much of it can cause problems. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that the baby and the mom both have cortisol and those stress hormones there, but they're working to kind of move the labor along. And lastly, we have the endorphins. Now, most people are familiar with endorphins. Those are those feel-good hormones. They also are natural pain relievers, and it helps deal with the discomfort of the contractions that are happening during labor, but it's also there to help bond after birth. Okay, so all of these play a role in the pregnancy and the labor. So how do these work together? Okay, this is an example I sometimes use with my clients that I work with. So just bear with me. Okay, so how many of you have ever been to an Airbnb or ever booked an Airbnb? Okay, most of you are probably familiar with that process, even if you haven't been there before. You search out for a property that meets your needs, you check the availability, you kind of make the reservation, and then the property manager sends you information to prepare for your arrival, to kind of check in. And when the time comes, you get the codes, you move your stuff in, you have fun, you stay for a little bit, and then after that time is over, you get another notification with some general reminders about what to do to check out. Okay, I use that similar analogy when it comes to labor and birth. Okay, to kind of get people to understand what happens after I've explained the hormones. Okay, so first we have the baby that's in there. Okay, the uterus is where the baby lives. That's the main guest house. Okay, and then we have progesterone, prostaglandins. The prostaglandins, those are the things that kind of soften the uterus. Estrogen and cortisol there to help keep everything nice and neat and tidy and making sure it's working, and so that everything is in the right balance. Okay, so the baby's in there kind of nice and cozy. Everything's good. All right, so the uterus has to contract for a vaginal birth to happen. Now I'm talking about vaginal birth. Okay, we learned that in all the different components, that's what's supposed to happen, with the vaginal birth and oxytocin and contractions and things like that. Okay, so just thinking about this, the uterus has little receptors. I call them little Airbnb VIP rooms for the oxytocin. One of the main rock stars is that oxytocin. So just remember that. And the oxytocin has to be there. And the estrogen in the system acts like the property managers. It wants to make sure that everything is staying in order so that when the oxytocin does come, that it's working properly, it doesn't have any inhibitions, and everything is working so the baby can get out. At this time, the baby is still producing the cortisol. Okay, baby's always producing cortisol, not necessarily in high amounts, but they're producing it. Okay, everybody got that? All right. So the hormone teams that we talked about occasionally have some run-throughs to kind of get prepped for when the oxytocin really comes. That's the same thing as when they have those little practice contractions, those Braxton Hicks contractions that we may be familiar with. All right. So it continues to do that. And as the baby's hormones increase, the hormones make more reservations and fill up more rooms in there. But it's not all the rooms aren't filled. So it's still just having increased Braxton Hicks contractions. Okay. So after that happens, then we end up getting a little bit more where the rooms start to fill up a little bit more. And then all of a sudden it gets full, where the oxytocin level gets so full that all the rooms are full, and then all the cortisol keeps continuing to where those contractions happen a little bit more often and a little bit more regularly. But once all the rooms are filled, then it's almost full to capacity. That's when we get the code that, hey, it's time to get out of there. Okay, so that's what starts to happen when the contractions start to build up. The cortisol starts to build up in the mom and the baby. Hopefully the good kind of cortisol, not the stressful kind, but the good kind of cortisol. And then after that starts to happen, then the baby is born. Of course, there's some other stuff that happens in there, but I try to get them to understand what happens with the cortisol, the progesterone, how that decreases, and everything starts to happen as a process. Okay. So after I've explained that and how that reservations kind of go, how those kind of go across and how the rooms kind of need to fill, I start to talk a little bit more about the landmarks of the basics of lactation. Now, I'm not as complicated as that, because most of the time what needs to happen is that we need to understand what needs to be in place in order for breastfeeding to start or chest feeding to start. Okay. So how does that process work? Prolactin has been playing a part in the background since the pregnancy, but it hasn't been prioritized because we have that progesterone is still there, just telling us that we're still pregnant or the person's still pregnant. Okay. But once that is cued, and it's cued by the birth, the progesterone drops. And once it starts to drop, the estrogen also drops a little bit. Oxytocin drops a little bit, and the endorphins rise. And once those endorphins start to rise, prolactin is standing by waiting for it to make its grand entrance to say, okay, what do we need to do to get started? So what triggers it? And this is when I go through and talk about this whole process of what triggers lactation. Okay. A lot of times since that prolactin has been there, that stimulation starts when there's a signal of with the nipples, and the signals, the nipples have a signal response to the hormones to start to produce the milk. Okay. This is there's a lot of other things that go along with it, but when I'm talking with my families, I try to stick to the hot points. Okay. So this also wakes up the oxytocin that was kind of laying there dormant. The oxytocin has been working along for the labor and the pregnancy, the labor and the birth, but now it's kind of dropped down a little bit. It's still there because we have to continue the rest of the processes on labor, but it's there for the lactation part to kind of get the milk flowing. Okay. That's that letdown reflex. Okay. So I call the process stimulation, signal, and dispatch. Okay. The stimulation comes from the nipples. It starts to, when the stimulation happens, it signals to the prolactin to start increasing. And then once that prolactin starts to increase, then the oxytocin says, okay, let's get it out. Okay. So you might ask, okay, Tonya, well, so now that's a crash course on the whole understanding the process of lactation, but you might be wondering, okay, but this talk is about birth practices and the impacts. Okay. I want you to think about this. Realize that everything connects to everything else. Everything that happened during that labor and that birth process, the normal progression of it, everything happens to what happens after. And getting families off to a good start doesn't start at just the latch and how they latch on. We want to make sure that if families are going to meet their lactation goals, that we have to start from the beginning, laying a stronger foundation of how they're dealing with things during that pregnancy and during that birth. So then we're not just putting a Band-Aid on something that needed to be fixed early on. Oftentimes as practitioners, and sometimes even as childbirth educators, sometimes we kind of separate the pregnancy piece of it, the labor and the birth, and the lactation piece of it, and as a childbirth educator, I've learned that even through my personal experience and experience as an educator, we can't separate the two. They are definitely connected. And so my goal for education is to help families understand that the process of labor and birth and how their decisions they make there affects how their lactation experience will go. I want to find out what they think is successful and help them get there. And that comes with the education. But unfortunately, as we know, a lot of times, sometimes people will contact you, especially if you're a provider, and talking about lactation and feeding issues and even pregnancy. Sometimes they're in their last trimester. That's that 32, 36 week mark when they're usually contacting me. And that's great that they're contacting me, but it's not an ideal time because I'm having to try to hurry up and teach them about, their birth practices, what their thoughts are, how they envision giving birth. And so when I think about this quote, I use as a frame of reference to say, okay, if somebody's coming in and talking about lactation, I'm really wondering, what was their birth like? What are they thinking about for their birth? What do they envision for their birth? Again, human milk feeding is a continuation of the birth process. The two are not separate. And by the time the families reach me, they're already thinking about them as separately. So I'm trying to switch the narrative there. So I'm reframing the conversation. One of the things that I do, and I challenge a lot of you, if you don't do it this way, to kind of consider it, is instead of asking if you're planning on breastfeeding or formula feeding or chest feeding and bottle feeding, instead of asking that, ask them, how are you planning on feeding this baby once the baby gets here? And when you ask a question that way, it pulls them away and makes them kind of think about a couple of things. That, first of all, why is she asking me it like that and not asking me, especially as a lactation consultant, why she's asking me not, and, am I not breastfeeding, but really getting them to draw the connection between the two. And that's what I do to really get them to understand. So part of the things that I do with that is, first and foremost, I start with the 6 healthy birth practices. Do we have any Lamaze childbirth educators out here? Can't see anybody, but if you do, okay. Well, these should be very familiar to you if you are. And if you are not, you can actually go on the Lamaze International website and they actually have them there. But we're going to frame this last part of the discussion about these healthy birth practices and around the healthy birth practices. And these are a list of six evidence-based standards of maternity care that increase the likelihood of safe and satisfying birth. And they were championed by Lamaze International and backed a lot by ACOG and a lot of the other organizations. And it talks about different things you can do, that families can do to make sure they have a safe and healthy birth, but also it addressed some of the most common interventions that are restrictive on improving those outcomes, okay? Most of our births today, particularly those in the United States, are heavy in interventions. And the majority of women that are surveyed, there was a survey done called Listening to Mothers by Childbirth Connection. They did a lot of surveying of women and found out what their most common interventions were and what their feelings were and what the outcomes of their experience were. And a lot of them talked about how some of them were detrimental to some of their postpartum and parenting experiences, which included the satisfaction with birth, their breastfeeding or lactation rates, initiation and duration, and sometimes even talked a little bit about their postpartum mood and mental health. Okay, so for the sake of time, we're going to just highlight some of these practices and discuss briefly the evidence and some of the things we know and some of the things we don't know. Now, like I said, if you want to read about some of these, I have a link here, but you can go on lamaze.org and they have handouts, and they do have handouts in their infographics, but they do have them in a variety of languages. So for those of you who work with diverse populations, you can probably find a language there that would serve the population that you're working with. Okay. So the first one, very simple, let labor begin on its own. Okay. A typical pregnancy lasts from 38 weeks to 42 weeks. We kind of know that, with the average being around 40 weeks or 41 weeks and maybe 3-4 days. Okay. And so when we talk about that, we talk about the hormones, and those hormones of the mom and the birthing person and the baby work together to start labor. So this happens when the timing is right. Okay. And that perfect timing jumpstarts labor that leads to the signaling of lactation. So what happens when you have an induction? Okay. So we know about the process of induction when things don't go right. Okay. When things don't go as planned, I shouldn't say go right. Okay. So what is an induction? Okay. Induction is medically starting or jump starting labor. Okay. So why would that happen and not necessarily happen medically? Anybody know anything about any reasons of why? I gave you a nice little cheat sheet, is on the is on the screen. Okay. But some of the typical ones are if they go past that due date, that cutoff. Okay. If there are health issues with the mom or the baby, there are a lot of variety of ones. So I just kind of lump them all together. If there are health issues with the mom or the baby, and labor can happen, but they want to have it monitored. So that'll be a reason. Suspected large baby, a baby at around 8.8 pounds or more. Now, I put an asterisk beside this because there have been several systematic reviews that talk about that sometimes that's beneficial, but also just inducing just because there's a suspected large baby has also been not beneficial as well. So I put an asterisk beside that just because a lot of times we hear that, people are being induced because they think the baby's too big. So sometimes that's an issue, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just a preference. Okay. And so, one of the things I wanted to point out was, excuse me, that about 1 in 4 first-time parents are being induced. Now I'm going to let that sit in for a little bit. 1 in 4 first-time parents are being induced. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when that happens, and then really think about the first-time parents, and their challenges that they have with lactation. Now, I'm not saying that, someone shouldn't be induced for some of these reasons that are there. I'm just saying especially when I'm talking with my families, is they need to do their research on whether or not it's beneficial for them to have an induction, which means they might need to find some alternatives or different things, or if it's not beneficial. Okay. And looking at what their goals are with their birth goals. Okay. In an induction, what typically happens, and why is this important? What typically happens is there's a synthetic administration of the hormone oxytocin and prostaglandins. Okay. So we have oxytocin and prostaglandins that are there to help get that uterus ready and that cervix ready to be able to birth the baby. In an induction, there's a synthetic form of prostaglandins, and there's a synthetic form of oxytocin called Pitocin. Okay, a lot of people are familiar with that. And sometimes it can take a few hours to a few days for labor to actually start with that, which means you got a person that's getting these synthetic forms of hormones into their body, and their body is trying to process what normally would happen now synthetically, which means some of the systemic issues and processes that happen normally are not happening on a regular basis there. So sometimes because it's synthetic, they don't get the signal to send to the prolactin or send to the other hormones that are conducive for lactation. And so why does that cause a problem? It causes a delayed release of prolactin, okay, which is a milk-making hormone, okay? It produces stronger contractions, which means you have the normal stress of the parent and the baby, but this produces strong contractions, which means it ups that stress level tremendously in some cases, which means it inhibits and start to have the delayed release of the natural oxytocin that's there. And since Pitocin is used as a catalyst, it's been shown to kind of cause things to go a little bit haywire, where people can't really get a handle on the contraction, and they'll start to ask for more medications and more different things that tend to suppress those other hormones that would work as well. Okay, and since when we talked about the Airbnb, how it kind of doses the filling up the oxytocin rooms that are in the uterus, Well, since those rooms are there and being filled up by Pitocin, oxytocin can't even have, an in there. It doesn't really, in most cases, doesn't really just jumpstart. So the body doesn't start to release the milk. So the tip here is to get families to really start to thinking about what are some natural ways to induce labor. Okay. Does anybody happen to know of any natural ways that you may have heard of people? You can put them in the chat. Any natural ways to induce labor? And I think we have some, the golden midwives. Yep, sex, because that gets the prostaglandins going and softening it. Nipple stimulation, perfect. Okay, because remember, we talked about the combination of the lactation and the breastfeeding. That nipple stimulation bumps that oxytocin up, so it gets that natural oxytocin going. Good. Spicy foods, yeah, that's what happened to me with my first one. I didn't realize that until so much later, but yeah, it did. The spicy foods. Okay, great. All right. So I see some, yeah. Okay, membrane sweeping, primrose and castor oil. And I'm glad somebody mentioned that too, because a lot of times with the people that we're working with, they've heard a lot of these too. And some of them will try. What I typically will ask, acupuncture, yes. What I typically will ask people, if you are using things like castor oil and different types of herbal remedies and things like that, I usually get them, especially because I am not an herbalist and I'm definitely not a medical provider. I typically will tell them, make sure you're talking with a medical provider to make sure that you know the signs and symptoms to look out for, just in case something goes awry. Because sometimes with some people with castor oil, castor oil and even like cod liver oil, people will do it because it has more of a laxative effect. Some people will use some of those things because they've read about them and not look at any of the guidelines around them, and end up having issues of diarrhea and vomiting and things like that, which can cause dehydration. So I usually tell them, talk with your providers, somebody who's familiar with a provider, that can be a midwife or an OBGYN who's more into holistic care, an herbalist, anybody like that can really help give them some parameters and some boundaries so they'll know what to look out for. Okay, so those are good options. Okay, so birth practice number 2, and I'm gonna pick this up a little bit. Walk, move around, and change positions throughout labor. Okay, so while it seemed to be the norm nowadays for people to be in bed, research shows that walking and change positions is beneficial. Walking with gravity can help the uterus work more efficiently, give more oxygen to the baby. It also gives the mom and the birthing person something to do, which can make them feel more confident and less fearful. Okay. So why is that? Restricting that a problem? The Listening Mother survey again said that about 3 out of 5 women and first-time mothers were encouraged to remain in bed after their labor. That's a lot of people, 3 out of 5. And this causes a problem because moving around can prolong the labor and cause the mom or the birthing person to be fatigued and cause more stress to them and the baby. And depending on what position they're in, can cause problems with the baby's oxygenation. Okay. If the labor is slow, you're going to have people talking about getting Pitocin up just normally. There's some other things to actually do to speed up the labor, like we were just saying with the nipple stimulation and things like that. But in a hospital that's not a baby-friendly hospital, or a hospital where people are not thinking more holistically, it can actually push towards using more Pitocin, which may be given to speed up the labor, but also remember what we were talking about of how it can inhibit some of those additional processes and triggering those other hormones. It also can cause an increased need for pain medication because naturally our bodies start to move around a little bit when it's in pain. You know, you grab your toe when you're hurt, you go to that, area. Okay. So one of the tips that we can use here that we talk to families about is to encourage them moving and changing positions at least every hour to hour and a half. Okay. And find out of their facility, whether it's a birth center, hospital, whatever, if they have peanut balls or birth balls. Using those will continue to get the baby to move down and start those natural processes of labor and birth. All right, so best practice number 3, bring a loved one, friend, or doula for support. Now, doulas have been a buzzword for the last couple of years, okay? But research has actually shown that having a loved one or family member is also beneficial. But doulas, they have done research on doulas and said doulas decrease the fear, decrease stress, increase knowledge and support and confidence. And they also have shown to increase the endorphin levels of the birthing person, okay? So having somebody there would actually help to get the labor going, but also empowers the birthing person to make some good decisions and remind them of some things that can help. So if they're restricting the labor support, which we saw this in its truest form in the pandemic, when they were starting to say that we couldn't have people, family members, or specifically and doulas in the room with the birthing person, it increased the fear. It increased the lack of advocacy of the birthing person's wishes, even though they had a class or talked about with a doula. But it also decreased birth satisfaction and the feelings of increased the feelings of inadequacy. Okay, which we know if people don't feel adequate during their birth, their rates of initiation and duration of breastfeeding drop tremendously. Okay, so one of the things we want to do is make sure they secure a doula to work with the support team, because, and I put with in italics because we need to have both, because a doula is not going to be with that person after they go home. They're not going to be with that person, you know, in the midnight hour, as they say. So having them work together, the doula can actually work and train and model that care for the family members, the partner, or the friends to be able to increase the likelihood of continuation. All right, number 4, avoid interventions that are not medically necessary. Now I'm going to go through these because these are just some ones on here, and you have the slides. Excuse me. You have the slides that talk about it a little bit more in detail, but as you see on this picture, there's a lot of interventions on this person that's here in this room. Okay, but the key thing I want to point out is not medically necessary. It doesn't mean that they can't use an intervention, but really think about what constitutes a medical necessity. And the rule of thumb is if the mom or the birthing person and the baby is in danger, then it can be viewed as a necessity. If it's not, then it calls to question, okay? And the reason why is because if you're starting off with one, a lot of times those interventions will lead to something else, more like the cascade of interventions, or more commonly known as a domino effect. You think about going back to birth practice number 1. If labor didn't start on its own and they were induced, then the birthing person might have to have the prostaglandins. They may have to come into the hospital the night before, get something inserted to soften the cervix, and then you get the Pitocin entered. But if the cervix is not right, then, ripe and soft, which means softened and able to dilate, then they're going to have to repeat the process, which takes longer. Most of the time during some of these procedures, they're not allowing people to eat a whole lot. Some hospitals may, some hospitals don't. Some providers may advocate for that or not. But if they're not, then you have a whole lot of different things that are happening that cause the parent to be fatigued. Add in Pitocin, contractions start to get stronger. You got fatigue and pain. When people get tired and pain ridden, they don't think straight. I'm just putting it plainly. They don't think straight, which means a lot of times they'll make decisions that they wouldn't normally make. And if they're talking about needing pain relief, the first thing they may do is say, oh, well, I don't know anything about pain. Yes, I want something. And they get an epidural. Well, not realizing that with an epidural, it's a package deal. You're in the bed, you have a catheter, you have blood pressure cuffs, you have the IVs, you have all these different things that say, stay where you are. You can't move around and do anything. And pretty much the labor has sometimes kind of spiraled out of control. And then for a person who wasn't planning that can cause a lot of problems. And especially if they get to a point where that epidural has reduced their feeling, where they can't feel anything or be able to push, you're going to have a lot of times a lot of other interventions that come to get the baby out that way. So we have to be mindful of how sometimes using unnecessary interventions, how it can impact that. Keeping in mind with all those different things we talked about, what effects does that have on the natural progression of the hormones? Okay. So I'm going to run through these really quickly. We know anesthesia, those are like your, I usually tell people, think about heavy duty Tylenol, Advil. They take the pain away, but you still have feelings. Most of your sense of feeling. Most of the time with some of those systemic analgesics, a lot of times people may have a little bit of a loopiness, or some, loop where they're just kind of dozing in and out and not feeling totally in control. Sometimes, depending on if it's in high doses, sometimes the baby might get that as well, depending on how long that's happened, which could also affect breastfeeding. And nitrous oxide is not fast, is not all, no, neither of those are long-term. They're usually pretty quick processing, but they do tend to work. And sometimes people will go on those, but they will have some effect on the baby and the mom and their receptiveness. But overall, with those and the epidurals, the effect on the babies, are pretty low, and the side effects are short term. But it depends on when it's actually given. Okay, if it's given early on, it's more in the system and may have some issues. So these are some of the things that may happen because of IV medications. Not all, but some of them. Fluid retention, especially if they've been on IVs for a long period of time. Breasts get really swollen, which means it's hard for the baby to latch. Okay, the mom and the baby they're drowsy or uninterested in breastfeeding. They've had all these drugs on board. Okay, the birthing person may feel that way, but the baby may feel that way as well. Babies may come out with a disorganized suck and an inability to latch because of a lot of the medications that has to kind of process out through the system. And sometimes there's possible changes in the baby's heart rate or the breathing or the muscle tone, depending on how long. So the tip there is to try to use some non-pharmacological pain relief. Getting a doula, start looking at different things where they can use some motion, moving around, using the balls. And if as much as possible, hydrate by mouth. If they're able to get drinks after every contraction, telling them and their support person to be able to do that, that will be helpful. Okay. All right. So what do you have to, if you had to go without food or drink for 16 to 24 hours and you're doing some hard labor, you're going to have a lot of things that are going on. So these are some of the impacts: lack of stamina, increased swelling, drops in blood sugar. Okay. And so if the mom or the birthing person is not well and not able, you're not going to have a good initiation for breastfeeding or providing that milk for the baby. So what I typically would tell people, if as much as possible, labor at home where you can eat and drink and rest and hydrate, and advocate for snacks in the hospital. Interesting enough, some places still have those restrictions of no eating and no drinking. You might get chicken broth or crackers or some. If you have a hospital who can give you more things, or a birthing place or center or a home birth where you can have more things, those are going to lead to better outcomes when it comes to being able to provide for that baby. Okay. Surgical and cesarean births, we kind of know what that is. And those happen 1 out of every 3 births by cesarean. That's a lot, y'all. 1 out of 3. And in the United States, the rates are highest among African American. And that was, March of Dimes actually posted that. And it's been going on for a while, but 1 out of every 3. So we really need to think about, if people are going to have a cesarean and it's not it is a medical necessity, what can we do to kind of bridge the gap between the two? Okay. Why do people have cesareans in general? Baby's not in a good position to be born vaginally. The position of the placenta is not in a good position. And the health issues for mom and baby that can't be done or handled vaginally. Those are typically the main 3 reasons, okay? When a cesarean birth happens, regardless of the reason, a lot of times there's an increase in the delay in prolactin and oxytocin to really cause that lactation process. A possible delay in skin to skin. Now I say possible because some places now are starting to have what they call a gentle cesarean, where they're allowing the birthing person and the baby to have some skin to skin time while during the cesarean. But then sometimes there's some trauma to the baby or the birthing person during the labor and the birth, whether it's loss of too much blood, whether there's something going on with the baby and the baby has to be separated. But those things lead to a separation. And when there's a separation there, of course, there's going to be impact on that initiation of that breastfeeding. And so my tip here is to go back and learn the 6 steps to healthy birth practices. Okay, but try to figure out what can we do to allay having a cesarean or surgical birth. But if there is a surgical birth, considering talking with the providers that you can have skin to skin while they're in the OR. Okay, and as soon as possible, feed, hand express, or pump within that first hour. Okay, because that'll help get everything jump started. All right. Follow your butt. Number 5, avoid giving birth on your back and follow the body's urges to push. We kind of talked about that before, with the moving around. The same things applied there, and the impacts of actually giving birth on their back is a longer, more stressful labor. Increased likelihood of vacuum and forceps, that's to help to get the baby out, and decrease oxygen to the baby. And so how do we do that? A lot of people don't know that during labor and birth, you don't have to give birth on your back. Those beds are transformers. Okay, those hospital beds are transformers. So if you want to be in the bed, fine, be in the bed, but there's a birth bar. It can sit up like a chair. It can do all kinds of things, but vary the positions. And if the provider that they're with wants to have them on a more in a reclined position, talk to them about doing everything you can up until that point, and then have them more upright. So what I found is actually giving resources and examples to the families that I work with, so they can take that and have a conversation with their providers, actually helps them to not have to get in their mind that they have to give birth on their back, because that's going to be helpful for both them and the baby. Okay. So I talk a little bit about, forceps and vacuum extractor like I had here with that, because a lot of times people aren't familiar with that. Those are typically used last minute, if they can't really get the baby out. But I also talk about how those things may hinder the lactation process as well, more so with actual feeding. Okay, as far as with the baby not being comfortable and don't want to be handled because they're either have bruising or nerve damage. So I talk about that. And so lastly, I've kind of hinted to this, is a healthy birth practice. Healthy birth practice is number 10. Keep you and baby together. It's best for you, baby, and breastfeeding. This mainly talks about the skin to skin piece. And how it, skin to skin really helps shift, no matter what the labor has been like. If we can get families to do that skin to skin, it can really shift those hormones to release that prolactin, increase the oxytocin in the body, and babies are less shocked and more likely to start breastfeeding. Now, I know we're definitely running out of time. I actually get 3, but I can send this link out as well. But this is the Global Health Media, and it shows a couple of things in there about what actually happens during those 9 instinctive stages of after a newborn is born, during that first hour. And that first hour, they're learning connection, they're learning smell, they're learning how to work their way to the breast, they're learning how to acclimate to the life on the outside. And the biggest thing is, if we allow them to do that at least 1 hour, they will latch on their own. And that's a piece that I think a lot of people miss out on, is that we don't have to do a whole lot of handling. If we allow that uninterrupted skin to skin, that they will get that whole process going. Separating babies will delay the skin to skin, will cause them not to go through that process and get that imprint. And then a lot of times they won't have those physiological recovery processes there. So if we can advocate for them, that for those families to have those uninterrupted time, it'll be great. So lastly, what I want to leave with you all is think about how you can integrate some of this information into your communications with families before they give birth. Okay, get them to understand. Go on the Lamaze site, look at the handouts that they have there. You can use those things. They have a lot of other tips on the handouts. They're very consumer friendly. Think about that. How can you also integrate it into the support that you have with families? How can you, when they're thinking about it, don't be afraid to even ask them, how are they planning on giving birth? What things have they thought about? And talk about how those things impact their lactation goals. And then lastly, who can you collaborate to support the families in your community to prepare for birth? Do you need to be connecting with a childbirth educator? Do you need to be talking with some of the local midwives or or practitioners to find out, okay, what do I need to know about what these processes are? So find out who you can connect with and reach out to them now. One of the things that I do is I make sure that everybody that I have as a doula client goes to a breastfeeding support group before they even start to have their baby, so they can start getting some of that information. And lastly, I want to leave you with this. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, you do better. And so sometimes we look back on things. I know I did. I look back and gosh, if I had known that this was going to cause this issue, then I wouldn't do it. I have to leave that alone, because now that I know what to do, that's when I talk to other people. And I know I zoomed through that, y'all. And if anybody wants to contact me, y'all know I will talk. I got off tangent a little bit from my notes, but but when really think about, when you know better, you do better. And that's what we need to do for our families, and really encourage them to be able to do better because they'll know better. And I think that's it. Oh, and my due diligence, my resources, but that's on the slide.
But Tonya, thank you so much. As you were talking, I just was starting to throw things that you were saying, links into the chat. The SERPs link is in there for anyone who needs it. And I added the link to the Global Health Media and the link to the Breastfeed Durham for families, our ongoing link of peer-to-peer support. And I want to take a moment and thank you, Tonya, for joining us. And
Thank you.
I want to thank the Carolina Global Breastfeeding Institute for paying for the credits for this gathering, and the Durham County Department of Public Health. And thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to hang out. I always call this the in the parking lot time. We're going to hang out here in the virtual parking lot if anyone has any questions or anything else. But for those of you who need to go on, thank you so much.
But thank you all.